This video will be pertaining to how the U.S. population continued to undergo significant demographic shifts that had profound cultural and political consequences in the 1980s. Rise of the European Union and China.
During the Cold War, the world was considered bipolar, the two major poles being the United States with its ideals of capitalism and the Soviet Union with their ideals of communism. However, in the early 1990s, multiple poles began to arise throughout the world, the most prominent of those poles being Europe and China. Europe gained its rise to power by creating the European Union, in which all of its nations were joined under a single federal state. China also grew significantly while maintaining a steady economic growth of roughly 10% a year. Initially, Europe and China's rise to power was beneficial to American consumers because there was an increased amount of exports to the United States. However, these benefits were short-lived due to job opportunities depleting as manufacturing within the United States was unable to compete with the mass production from China. China also maintained a low currency against the American dollar bill by purchasing American debt. If this trend continues and China gains more than their 25% of total U.S. debt, American manufacturing will suffer severely.
An era of globalization.
When the Cold War ended and foreign restrictions were eliminated, technologies and new forms of communication enhanced America's relationship with foreign countries. Advancing in communication, broadening the United States' international trade expanded global financial markets to unimaginable lengths and revolutionized trade as a whole. During this time in international trade, the original industrial nations that composed the Group of Seven accepted Russia into the alliance, creating the Group of Eight. The group included the United States, Britain, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, Canada, and newly joined Russia. These nations controlled a large majority of international financial trade, and in 1995, they combined all their organizations into the World Trade Organization. The advancement of international trade and globalization led to the enhancement of regional economies as well, and this in turn led to the regional trade advancements made by treaties such as the North American Free Trade Agreement. The growth of globalization was driven by the desire of increase of markets and the search of cheaper forms of labor.
Revolutions in technology.
Advances in technology during the 1980s and the 1990s allowed the general public to access information as the events took hold. As cell phones and personal computers dominated the everyday spreading of information, a revolution started with instant information that could only be compared to the mass market of household televisions in the 1950s. The World Wide Web changed the way work and leisure was done on an everyday basis. It gave any individual person the ability to search and find any piece of information available on the web. Socialization changed as cell phones with the ability to text and spread instant social information spread across the country. A side effect of these technologies is increased globalization and how countries interact with each other. Technology in the last 3 decades has greatly increased how the world and individuals react, along with affecting the culture and internal affairs of the United States.
An increasingly plural society.
Over time, America has become a melting pot of racial and ethnic variety. It is estimated that in 2040, the United States population will have no specific race considered the majority of the nation. This trend of racial diversity first began in the 1990s as immigration became more apparent and topics of racial and ethnic identity became more controversial. The population of America drastically increased over the course of 30 years. A large majority of new immigrants came from Latin American countries, and a portion of them came from Asian countries, but settled more in the south and west of the United States. The dramatic increase of immigrants into the United States was due to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. This act got rid of the 1924 quota system and replaced it with easier access into the country, slightly improved lenience on immigration limits, easy entrance for those with high demand skills, and an exception to the immigration limit for those who had immediate family residing legally within the country. These changes to immigration quota directly influenced the mass amount of Latin American immigrants into the United States. Many of the family members that were legal citizens in America were Latin Americans seeking refuge and a way to support their families during the civil wars of the 1980s. However, there was a significant amount of political controversy that followed those Latin Americans who came into the United States without legal documentation. The overwhelming number of immigrants residing illegally led to a new Immigration Reform and Control Act passed by Congress in 1986, offering citizenship to those who arrived illegally. This reform also kept employers from hiring immigrants without documentation, as well as increasing border control from Mexico into the United States. Many Americans viewed the entrance of illegal immigrants into the United States as an act of invasion, and a great amount of discrimination followed those immigrants who came from Latin American countries. Some states would go as far as not providing basic services for these immigrants, deeming it as a way to protect the well-being of the country. As native-born Americans became more unsure of the increase of racial diversity, the term multiculturalism was coined by those who were willing to accept social and cultural diversity. With time, certain states adopted the idea of multiculturalism, while others still proved its limitations.
Clashes over family values.
The United States reached a new era in values. There was a clash between the so-called family values. A new generation had taken control of the population of the United States. With this, change was due. Since the 70s, marriage had taken a new turn. Instead of strong, steady marriages such as in the 50s, it was modernized and drifted away from traditional views. This, in turn, made the divorce rate go up, as couples were not locked down in a marriage and were not looked down upon if they separated, as it was socially accepted. At the congruent time, abortion and gay rights had a big impact on society as it conflicted with past views in the early 19th century. Feminists argued that abortion should be legal, and religious conservatives the opposite. As one side, the feminists argued that it was a woman's basic right to have control over their body. Conservative religious groups argued that the fetus was a living being and abortion was murder against God. Just as they would argue that homosexuality, which at the time was conflicting with past views, was wrong, but they were met with opposition. The homosexual population, male and female, during the late 20th century grew to where the United States government had to take federal action. Gay rights started to come out in states, and even federal laws were passed allowing homosexuality, as it would form into the topic today. All these topics were monitored by the Supreme Court and eventually both allowed. Gay rights to an extent, as it is no longer illegal today, but the new topic of homosexual marriage has taken turn. These two highly controversial subjects, which are now known as part of the culture wars, has affected American society and culture by opening new doors to homosexuality and feminist arguments.
The Clinton presidency.
Clinton went into power in 1994 and threw the Democratic side of the nation into a flip, as there not had been a president Republican in power in decades. Since 1954, the Republicans did not have a large presence in Congress, and now they had power to do what suits their political party. Due to this, Clinton claimed that the big government was over and avoided social welfare policies. This carried little impact on the economic side of the U.S., but sent a big message to Democrats across the nation, saying that the Republican resurgence was here to stay. After Clinton had made his point, halfway through his presidency, he was almost impeached for an alleged sex affair with a White House secretary. The vote did not pass, and Clinton went on to serve his term.
Post-Cold War foreign policy.
Even though the sex scandal weakened Clinton's power, he still wanted to make international changes. Soon after the Cold War, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, became less exclusive and invited 12 countries into it, mostly from Eastern Europe, two of which, Slovenia and Croatia, had both been Yugoslavia. Bosnia-Herzegovina, which recently split from Serbia, also tried to join NATO. Serbia tried to reclaim the province, but with American help, it retained its autonomy. In 1953, the U.S. sponsored the overthrow of Iran. The U.S.'s actions in the Middle East were particularly abhorrent to Muslims. This created a group of radical Muslims who were vehemently opposed to Western ideas. The United States presence influenced the Muslims to start targeting Americans. Clinton sent air raids into al-Qaeda air bases where they got trained, but it failed to even dent the terrorist network. This all happened right before the end of Clinton's presidency.
The ascendance of George Bush.
After Clinton, the Republicans nominated George W. Bush, while the Democrats Al Gore. What would ensue would be the closest election in United States history, with Bush becoming the president by the smallest of margins. The first major thing Bush would do in his presidency was to pass the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Act. This cut almost all taxes humongously, and many feared that this would plunge the government into debt. Federal spending also increased by 33%, mostly because of health care. Bush believed his presidency would be based on domestic issues, but that changed very quickly. On September 11, 2001, two planes crashed into the World Trade Center and one into the Pentagon. This day single-handedly changed American thinking. Immediately, Bush declared a war on terror. America raided al-Qaeda training place now in Afghanistan, but failed to capture their leader, Osama bin Laden. Bush introduced the USA Patriot Act, believing the war on terror also had to be fought beyond normal law enforcement means. This act allowed for monitoring citizens and to get the right to act before the axis of evil, composed of Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, strike. In addition, America came up with the idea to democratize Iraq. The federal government did this to hopefully start a domino effect and get a hold on the oil. Almost all the other countries condemned the action when the U.S. finally invaded Iraq. Even when all of Iraq was trying to fight U.S., Bush said to stay the course. Bush played on this nationalism to get reelected in 2004.
Violence abroad and economic collapse at home.
1 year into Bush's second term, disaster struck again. First was Hurricane Katrina that caused over 2,000 deaths alone and showed the vulnerability of cities. In Iraq, the war became increasingly violent and increasingly frowned upon. In 2008, a recession happened. Unemployment surged up to 10%, while house costs fell 40%. Banks and insurance companies were on the verge of collapse, and the automotive industry went bankrupt. The government even passed the Emergency Stabilization Act, which gave $700 billion to banks and brokerage houses. The government spent over $1 trillion to save the financial system. In the middle of the Great Recession, the next president was to be elected, and the first black president was elected, Barack Obama.
The Obama presidency. The Obama presidency had a lot in store for demographics in the United States. The newly elected president not only made political changes, his position represented something very great. An African-American president meshed very well with the growing multiracial and nationally cultured America. Obama took office during the biggest economic deficit since the Great Depression. His mission was to set an optimistic tone in remaking America. Obama's foremost goals were to pull out of Iraq and focus the nation's military in Afghanistan, and fix the nation's healthcare. Similarly to Franklin Roosevelt, Obama spent his first 100 days as president organizing an assault of stimulating federal spending to reboot the nation's economy. Most of this agenda was and still is being accomplished. The biggest change that occurred demographically, though, was the shift in racial attitude from the 1970s to now. Not 30 years ago, blacks couldn't even sit near whites. Now an African American held the highest political office. Obama himself was nonchalant about this historic feat, obviously a clever strategy to downplay race in hopes of a continuously equal society. Regardless, this was a time that consisted of many social and economical changes in the United States that have both profound political and cultural emanation. The formation of the Immigration and Nationality Act was intended to A. Increase flow of immigrants throughout the U.S., B. Replace the Emergency Quota Act, C. To direct the flow away from family relations and immigrant skills, D. To create a larger labor force. The correct answer is C. Contrary to common belief, the Immigration and Nationality Act was not intended to increase immigration from neighboring countries. It was actually to shift the focus to the skills and roles of immigrants demographically rather than immigration itself, therefore rewriting the entire Emergency Quota Act and creating a new immigration policy. Debates over abortion were disapproved by which of the following groups? A. Protestant fundamentalist, B. Feminists, C. Radical Republicans, or D. Homophiles? The correct answer is A. Feminists argued that abortion was a fundamental right of any person and should be a decision that the woman could make for herself. The primary offender of this argument were Protestant fundamentalists. This is due to the specific outlawing of abortion in their religion. A large population of Americans at this time were Protestant, making them a primary contender for opposition. Feminism in the late 1900s was mainly characterized by which of the following? A. Moral and religious reform, B. Debates over labor and the female role in society, C. Stereotypical motherhood, or D. Labor unions and health clubs? The correct answer is B. The biggest change that represented feminism in the late 20th century is usually considered to be the debates over women's roles in society. We see a profound shift in respect over women in the women workforce in this era. Women's place in the family, careers, and even politics changed forever and is still changing today. What was the biggest consequence of economic globalization during the 1960s to 2000s? A. Increased immigration to European countries. B. Consumerism and consumer products. C. Increased trade among nations. D. Laissez-faire effects on national banking. The correct answer is C. The biggest consequence of economic globalization was increased trade among nations. This is primarily due to the emergence of stronger international economic framework. Programs such as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the World Trade Organization gradually allowed nations to cut down trade barriers and open their capital accounts.